This is Venice, Italy. It's one of the world's most popular tourist destinations, with 5.7 million visits in 2023 alone. But behind its stunning canals lies a brutal history shaped by desperate and ruthless ambition. That history starts with the location of Venice and its geography, which begs the question, what kind of people would be crazy enough to build a city on water? Venice has its foundation in troubled times. It was the 5th century and the Western Roman Empire was rocking on its foundations. Wave after wave of so-called barbarian tribes came into the empire, some of them fleeing from other tribes. The Goths sacked Rome itself in 410, and that was only the start of troubles to come. Tradition has it that 11 years later, in 421, the first people arrived here, at the Venetian lagoon, and founded the town at the stroke of noon on March 25th. But there's more evidence for a slightly later foundation, prompted at the hands of the most notorious barbarian of them all. Look at the lagoon on a map, and it doesn't seem like a good place to build a town, but it provided safety from this man, Attila the Hun. Attila turned his attention to Italy in 451 and 452. The 452 campaign hit especially hard. The Huns sacked Milan and reduced Aquileia in northeastern Italy to a ruin. This city was once one of the most important in Roman Italy with over 100,000 people. Today, it's about 3,500. Take a look at the map again. Notice how close Aquileia is to Venice? People from there fled to the lagoon in great numbers as the Huns came in and laid the city to waste. They all probably breathed a sigh of relief when Attila came to an end under mysterious circumstances the following year, but it was only a temporary respite. The Lombards came 100 years later. In 568, they hit the rump Aquileia and destroyed it for the final time in 590. The final Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was forced to abdicate in 476. They had no choice but to survive these tribulations themselves by going to the lagoon. But how did a city built on desperation become a global power? The answer lies in 3 unlikely resources. The earliest Venetians might have been in a tough spot, but the lagoon gave them crucial benefits. The first one was fish. Being located in a saltwater lagoon, there were plenty to go around. Fishing in the Venetian lagoon is still a popular tourist activity today. But if Venice wanted to be anything more than a fishing village, it needed other resources. And it had them. Timber was also around in abundance, and that was how the early Venetians could build a more durable settlement. Construction started with wooden piles that might have looked just like these. These posts were driven into the sandy bottom of the lagoon. Each touched the next one until the people cut the tops off to create a solid platform. Then the first Venetians began to build houses on top of them. This work continued for 400 years, where millions of these wooden piles accumulated to eventually support stone buildings. If you go to Venice today and look at all these buildings, you might not realize that those platforms are still below many of them. The early Venetians also increased the size of the marshy islands they were sheltering on by digging the city's famous canals and using yet more wooden planks to shore the banks. That is how Venice got its modern size. But wait, doesn't the wood rot? Almost miraculously, it actually doesn't. That's because the stakes were driven into marshy ground and surrounded by water, so there wasn't enough pure oxygen to rot them. There's also a peculiar quality about the water in a lagoon. It's not pristine. Rather, it's contaminated with silt and the salt that would prove useful for the city's earliest commerce. With centuries of exposure to these elements, the wood has petrified and become more like stone, so it's surprisingly durable. Surplus timber could be traded, so the wood gave Venetians more than construction material. It was also a source of revenue. The location had other benefits for the early Venetians. By turning the harsh lagoon into a viable city, the people were well protected from the turbulence that continued to engulf Italy throughout the Middle Ages and early modern periods. They could watch safely from their easily defensible lagoon as the popes, dukes, and Holy Roman emperors fought each other on the mainland, all while they concentrated on trade. By trading with everyone, they could manipulate all the factions against each other for their benefit. That was where the third advantage of the lagoon came in. There was a lot of salt on hand, and salt was a vital commodity. In the era long before refrigeration, it was the only reliable food preservative, especially for meat and fish, making it essential for both everyday survival and military provisioning. Venice's control over salt production and trade routes gave it leverage in both domestic and international markets. Entire cities depended on it, and Venice could name its price. They established state-run salt works, enforced trade monopolies, and even went to war over it. For centuries, Venice's salt trade helped bankroll its empire, fill its coffers, and fuel the construction of its iconic palazzos. But little did these early Venetians know that the salt which made their city rich would one day threaten to destroy it. The Venetians' geographical position also made them the natural gateway to Constantinople and the riches of the East by coming the way of the Silk Road, especially spices like pepper. And thanks to their help against some troublesome Norman adventurers, the Byzantines granted the Venetians unrestricted access to their markets. It was a tremendous competitive advantage that the Byzantines later regretted. Two main trade routes emerged. The northern route spanned from Venice to the Morea in Greece, Constantinople, and then the Black Sea up to Crimea and the Sea of Azov. The southern route went to Crete and then from there to Alexandria in Egypt or further east to Cyprus. By the 13th century, Venice was at the center of a sprawling trade empire. It was quite the turnaround. Things were pretty good for Venice, and the city's authorities would make damn sure they stayed that way. And they accomplished this in a pretty simple way, ignoring what is known today as human rights. Venice might have called itself a republic since 697, but that word meant something much different to the Venetians than it does to us today. Venice wasn't a democracy. It was run by a small group of wealthy families. The elected Doge was at the top of the government, but there was a great council too. By the mid-13th century, it had 100 members that exercised legislative power and elected the other officials in the city. There was a coup in 1310 by these men, the nobles Bahamonte Tiepolo and Marco Querini, who tried to overthrow the then Doge Piero Gradenigo and the Great Council. The attempt failed, but Venice responded by turning into a full-blown surveillance state. A new body was organized, the Council of Ten. It sat here, in this scenic building on the water, known as the Doge's Palace or the Palazzo Ducale. It's a beautiful place to visit today, but this building wrote some dark chapters in Venice's history. The Ten made their decisions in secrecy. By 1319, they had their own police force, the Capit di Sestieri. They also created a widespread surveillance network like a medieval NSA, partially by encouraging citizens to snitch on each other by way of the so-called lion's mouths. Venice had special mailboxes in those days, often carved in the shape of a lion, but it wasn't to make the city more scenic. All mail stuck through the lion's mouth would go to the Council of Ten. They at least had the good sense to force individuals to sign their name if they were accusing a neighbor of a crime because they didn't want to get involved in settling private scores. But public officials could be accused anonymously. If the council thought you were up to no good, the last thing you would see before being taken to prison was this: the Bridge of Sighs. Then darkness awaited, the Doge's hospitality. It was a wet place. The prison's lower reaches would often flood during high tide. Venice was on the water after all, but the water would be the least of your worries. The Doge's prison was filled with devices designed to inflict the maximum amount of non-lethal pain possible. One of the council's favorites was this, the strappado. And you can guess what it was for just by looking at it. Those convicted of capital crimes were ended between these, the two columns on the Piazzetta outside the Doge's palace. Even today, the Venetians consider it bad luck to walk between them. The Council of Ten was supposed to be temporary, but there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. The Ten grasped at more and more power and lasted at various levels of influence until the Republic's end. Venice's place at the center of Mediterranean trade made it particularly vulnerable to disease, and it was among the hardest places hit by the Black Death. An estimated 100,000 people fell to the disease. The Black Death hit all of Europe hard, but Venice, like most places, eventually recovered from it. What it couldn't recover from, however, was the changes in world politics as the early modern era began. Venice probably should have thought twice about its attempts to weaken the Byzantine Empire. Great changes took place when the Ottoman Turks brought Constantinople under their rule in 1453. Although the Ottomans and Venice generally had good trade relations, the pressure the Turks brought to the rest of Europe prompted other countries to look for alternative ways to reach the east. Soon, the other powers, starting with Spain and Portugal, but eventually encompassing the French, Dutch, and British as well, reached the New World and were sailing around the Cape of Good Hope to India and the Far East. Venice tried hard to stop this. In one of history's more unusual alliances, it joined a coalition of Muslim powers to try to block Portugal's access to the Indian Ocean. It resulted in a battle here at Diu off the coast of India in 1509. Unfortunately for Venice, Portugal won and secured the trade routes for itself and future European powers to come. Venice rapidly lost its grip as one of the centers of trade between the East and West. One of its more interesting last gambles was to try and build its own Suez Canal in 1586, but the attempt ended in failure. Venice's geographical position was now a disadvantage as it was far from the Atlantic coastline, and it simply couldn't compete. It was a backwater by the 17th century and had no chance of stopping Napoleon when he came around in 1797. So went the independent Republic of Venice. The city then passed hands between France, Austria, and finally, a united Italy. But it still benefits from its unique history, which has made it a center of global tourism. It's still built on the water, though. What if it sinks? These are pictures from the Great Flood of 1966, where an unusual combination of high tide and bad winds burst Venice's canals and sent water through its historic buildings. Priceless pieces of history were ruined. Thousands were trapped in their homes, and 5,000 were left homeless. Another huge flood came in 2019, when 85% of the city was deluged. The waters were just short of the historic levels seen in 1966. Sea levels are rising, and that threatens the city's survival. The European Geosciences Union thinks the water could rise 3 feet by 2100. That's why Italy's government has created the MOSE system for Venice. This is a series of mobile barriers that can shield multiple inlets from rising water. It was first deployed in 2020 in anticipation of a tide that would rise up to 4 feet. The city's mayor, Luigi Brugnaro, claimed the system was a success, as the city remained dry. But it's more than just a dramatic flood. The rising sea levels are allowing salt to accumulate on the lower walls of buildings through a continuous process of evaporation and recrystallization, threatening their structural integrity. That's why Mario Piana, a professor of architectural conservation at the LUAV University of Venice, suggests that the brickwork on the lower walls should go through a continuous process of desalination. It would be a cruel irony if the very salt that allowed the first Venetians to establish themselves winds up making their city unsustainable in the end. Bye for now.